Welcome to this meeting of the Culture, Media and Sports Select Committee. Today we are continuing our inquiry into British film and high-end television with some of the major studios and streamers making film and high-end TV in the UK. So I'm very pleased today to welcome Benjamin King, who is the Senior Director of Public Policy at Netflix, Mitchell Simmons, who's the Vice President of Public Policy and Government Affairs EMEA at Paramount, Chris Bird, who is the Managing Director at Amazon Prime Video UK, and Gidon Freeman, the Senior Vice President, Government and Regulatory Affairs at NBC Universal International. You're all very welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today. And I'm going to start the questions, and I'm going to start with you, Gidon. It's been a turbulent few years for the industry. How have the pandemic and the US strikes and broader market forces influenced your company's view of the UK as a destination for making high-end TV and film?
I think it has been a challenging few years. The pandemic had the effect of closing all cinemas in the world, effectively, more or less, and shutting down all physical production in large parts of the world. In the UK, we were the first company to restart production in early July of 2020 with Jurassic World Dominion, that at the time of the suspension had about 900 people working on it at Pinewood. We were delighted to be able to get that up and running again in July of 2020. As you say, that was shortly after, just as the industry was recovering from that shock. The strikes struck and suspended production again for another 6 months for all productions that were covered by the US Guild agreements, which is a large proportion of the inbound investment productions that take place in the UK. We're very pleased that those were settled, and we're now in more of a steady state production-wise.
Of the other panel members, has your company's view of the UK as a destination for making TV and film, has it changed at all in the last few years, or has it remained the same? Chris?
I mean, our ambition for the UK has only grown in recent years. The level of investment we're making and the number of TV shows and movies we're making has grown massively. In the last 6 years or so, we've made more than 100 TV shows and movies in the UK. We've made major investments in infrastructure. You may have seen recently we opened Shepperton Studios, took a long lease there, have built 9 new sound stages, added 450,000 square feet of state-of-the-art production space, workshops, offices, etc. It really is a first-class environment to be making film and TV. And I know we had tried to get the committee down for a tour at some point. Hopefully we will be able to do that, because I'd love you to see it firsthand. But that's a real indictment of our commitment and ambition for the UK space for the future.
Well, may I start first by thanking the committee for the invitation to come and speak today on the topic of this very important inquiry. Certainly, the last few years have been very turbulent, as you said, for the sector, and we do feel very deeply for all of the crew whose livelihood have been impacted through the pandemic and the more recent strikes and the ensuing uncertainty that caused. But I think at the same time, and not to diminish all of that, the long-term potential for the UK is really materially unaffected by what has happened in the last couple of years. We feel very bullish about its potential. Some of you may already be aware that it's the second most important market for Netflix from a production perspective globally. So for the last few years, we've been spending over $1.5 billion here every year on UK-made content. That's over $6 billion since 2020. And so we're very invested in the long-term success of the creative ecosystem. We've put down very deep roots here, and we are certainly committed for the long term, and our appetite for investing in UK content and the attractiveness of UK content and the UK as a global destination for production is every bit as strong as it ever has been. At the same time, I think we cannot afford to be complacent. My message to policymakers today would be to think hard about the industry that we want to have in 10 years' time, not just the one that we have today. And in particular, we need to keep a very keen eye on other markets to ensure that we retain our competitive edge, because this is an industry which countries around the world are waking up to the attractiveness of and are intent on seeking to recreate. And so we need to index our own competitiveness against those of our sort of nearest neighbours when it comes to other production destinations around the world. I think if we're able to do that, then the UK is in a very good spot for the long term.
Who is snapping at the UK's heels when it comes to attracting productions, and why?
Well, from a global perspective, I think Australia, British Columbia and Canada, the states of Georgia and New Jersey all stand out. So I think closer to home, probably Hungary and Spain. And I think all of those would be for a combination of very competitive tax incentives, very good quality studio infrastructure and facilities as well, and in some countries a lower overall cost of production than we have in the UK.
Mitchell, there's been a sort of a suggestion that there's the end of the content arms race now and the focus on quality rather than quantity. Is that something that you recognised as a company, and will that in any way impact productions that are being made here in the UK and the sort of budgets that they have to spend?
It's certainly true. Firstly, thank you for having me at this committee. It's certainly true that there's been a shift in the dynamics of the industry, much wider than simply for our companies specifically, and that relates to the dynamics of people viewing more away from linear, more towards streaming, the shifts in the ad market, the different revenue models that people are exploring. I think the underlying fundamentals of the UK mean that it has a highly skilled workforce, it has a vibrant independent production community, it has a good tax incentive regime, which means that the UK is a great place to make and create content. And to answer your question more directly, we think the notion of an arms race suggests that at some point it will sort of overheat and that there's too much inflation in the market. We would argue, I think, that there is ample opportunity still in the UK for a mixed ecology. We are obviously a big studio investor. We make big productions in the UK, things like Mission Impossible. We're making Sonic 3 at the moment. We've just got Knuckles has just gone onto Paramount Plus around the world. But equally, we're investing in smaller films, smaller televisions, and obviously we're also the owner of a public service broadcaster in Channel 5, where we are spending a significant amount of money over a much larger number of productions, and we still think there is space for a mixed ecology in the UK. And so we kind of refute the argument that there's a sort of arms race of content taking place.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for coming on this afternoon. Obviously, we've seen quite a few tax changes in the last couple of years for the film industry, and because of the new independent tax relief, do you think that you will be producing more films that are below £15 million in budget? I think I'll come to Chris first, if I may.
Yeah, so absolutely, and I think it's a very, very welcome addition to the independent film space. Something that independent film in the UK has been calling for a long time. I know our expectation is that we increase films that we make in that space by some number, probably between 20 and 30% in the next year or two. The independent film space more broadly, I think, will benefit from not just more films being made, but more opportunities created for new and upcoming independent filmmakers. And I think we just have to remind ourselves that some of the success that we see in the broader film ecology in the UK really stems from the grassroots of independent filmmaking. I don't think we would have Christopher Nolan winning the Best Director for Oppenheimer had he not made Following 20 years ago. Our own, we made Saltburn with Emerald Fennell last year. She has her roots in independent filmmaking also. So we have to really appreciate the training ground and nurturing and development opportunities that independent film provides for British talent. And I think it's a very positive thing that we can see more of that coming through in the future years.
Benjamin.
We are delighted about the introduction of the independent film tax credit. It is what the industry was campaigning for some time. It was much needed. Lower but smaller budget films are an area that we've consistently invested in for some time now. both through our own commissions, so titles like Scoop, for example, the account of the Emily Maitlis interview of Prince Andrew is perhaps the most recent example of that, but then also over the last couple of years, films like I Came By and I Used to Be Famous and The Wonder, but then in addition, titles that we have acquired as well. So Bank of Dave is a great example, was a huge success for us. The sequel is being filmed, I believe, as we speak, and then other titles as well, like Christmas on Mistletoe Farm. So we are very supportive of smaller budget films, both for the cultural contribution that they make, but also the contribution they make in terms of helping to develop the talent pipeline and build up that strong stable of IP and ideas and creativity, which has been a consistent strength of the UK's over the last few years.
Same question to you.
I think it's probably, in truth, a little early to say. I think I echo what Chris and Benjamin have said so far about the ability of a lower budget enhancement to the relief to incentivise additional activity in the up-and-coming filmmaker area. Generally speaking, we don't think we're very supportive of the creation of that relief, and we contributed to the discussions as it was being developed in advance of the budget, and stand four square behind it. But we don't think it's actually intended for companies like ours. We already act on the very generous incentives that already exist under the old film and high-end TV tax relief and the new audiovisual expenditure credit, which I'm sure we'll get onto at its core in more detail. Yeah. I think the question of whether we would benefit from it is almost a secondary question, because the real point of it is to fill a gap in the market. And I know that the contributions you received in the written evidence process were extremely compelling, that there is a shortage of that level of budget films. That isn't to say that we would never use it, but I don't think it's strictly intended for us.
Yeah, fair enough. Mitchell, same question to you.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with much of the sentiment that's just been said. I think one thing from us and from where Paramount has sit, Paramount historically had invested quite significantly in, I hate to use the phrase low budget, but low cost British films, sort of around the sub £5 million mark. It then had a hiatus for a number of years, and around 2019 started to increase investments and try to find projects. And to just give you an example of that pipeline, so in 2019, Rap Man was an upcoming director on YouTube, created Blue Story, did a short for Blue Story, received development funding for a script from BBC, PSB involvement, then seeks funding, Paramount then fund that project. Blue Story absolutely smashes the box office away, does I think 1.3 million on opening, hits 4 million, it's 4 million total UK box office. Then as a result of that, from its good theatre run in the UK, gets theatrical release in the US and South Africa. And then of course, that puts him, Rap Man, as a director on stage, the cast, the crew. And suddenly you come now a few years later and Rap Man now has a show, a big budget hit, big show coming to Netflix. So I think, there's a fundamental point that it's that pipeline that it creates is really important. And so we are keen to, we think that the changes will make it easier for companies like ours it will de-risk investment in smaller projects. And I think that's where we see the benefit. And so to answer your original question, yes, we likely see an increase in both the number of projects and the amount of spend on those projects.
Okay. Sticking with you, Mitchell, I mean, we know there's also increased credit for visual effects also being offered as well. How does that impact on what you do?
So I'll try and talk an example. So for a project that is, say, a global show, so something like Mission Impossible, where you're shooting in 6-7 jurisdictions, maybe more around the world, the changes in terms of the uplift of VFX will be welcome, but the removal of that 80% threshold, which means you're only allowed to benefit from the credit for 80% of the spend, wouldn't have a significant impact. But for smaller budget films where primary physical production is in the UK, there are clear examples where you've done physical production in the UK, you're hitting the 80% threshold, and then the finances just don't make sense for you to do the VFX in the UK. So Paramount, we've actually done a lot of VFX in the UK. We very much see the UK as a good hub for VFX. So we've done Ridley Scott's upcoming Gladiator 2. The weather isn't good enough, shall I say, in the UK for Gladiator, so it was filmed in Malta, but the VFX was done in the UK, the same for IF and the same for other projects. But just to give you an example of how it might change, I was speaking last week to the producer of Tuesday, which is a UK-British film. It's getting released in the US next week, I think. Funded by BFI support, BBC, and it follows the story of a terminally ill child and the relationship with the family, and it has a macaw as represents death. Now, they produced that film, and they hit the 80% threshold, and the VFX shots went to Canada as a result. And I think the likelihood is that had the opportunity to do the VFX in the UK, they would have done the VFX in the UK. So we think it will make a very clear difference in terms of ensuring that where physical production is in the UK and you want to do VFX in the UK, that studios are able to do that.
Understood. And by the way, best weather in the country, obviously Devon. So if you want to film anything in Devon, I'm all up for that.
I'll take that feedback back.
Benjamin, same question to you about these visual effects credits.
Well, I'm certainly a big fan of Devon. We advocated very, vocally and proactively for the introduction of the removal of the expenditure cap, because we shared numerous examples with Treasury of shows that we were making in the UK where, by virtue of the fact that we were hitting that cap, the VFX work was moving overseas, when all other things being equal, we would have been quite happy for it to remain in the UK. And that was a problem that I think was being replicated across the industry to the extent that one of our VFX houses, I believe, opened an office in France precisely to sort of service that need, if you like, which seemed a sort of fairly extraordinary state of affairs. So we are very confident that now, with the changes to the design of the tax credit, more VFX work will be able to stay in the UK. And as we've said to government consistently, it's not only good news for the industry, but it's good news from a skills perspective, and it's good news from a technology perspective as well. A lot of this technology is transferable to other industries and other sectors. We want to have as much of that in the UK. We want to have people with the skill sets to operate it, to the point I made earlier about designing an industry for 10 years' time rather than just the one we have today. This is exactly where we need to be forward thinking. So I think the VFX incentive is going to be good news all round.
Gidon.
I don't have much to add, other than the same situation applies to us. There are titles that we've made in the last 2 or 3 years where we have reached the 80% of budget cap and taken the VFX work, the post-production of VFX work outside of the UK to access incentives elsewhere. But there are also plenty that fall into the category that Mitchell described, where a film has been shot in 6 different places and we're nowhere near the 80% cap, and it wouldn't have made, and we weren't in danger of hitting it. Overall, I think if it provides producers with greater flexibility and encourages and nurtures a high-value industry that has other applications outside of feature film production, I think that's terrific.
And Chris, finally to you.
Just fully concur with Ben and Gidon, really. Like the removal of the cap is certainly a welcome addition. We work closely with the Screen Alliance, and I know that they've been petitioning for that for a long time. It does seem, really a backward step that productions here in the UK would need to go abroad simply to do the post-production. So we're very, very pleased to see that change.
Any lessons to learn from the way the government's handled this? Because obviously it seems this has been largely welcomed by you all, but is there anything that could have been done better? I want to go through all of you, unless some of you have got some specific suggestions. Gidon.
Well, I think you're talking about the creation of the audiovisual expenditure credit from the get-go. I mean, I think the logic behind doing it in order to comply with the OECD tax treaty was coherent. The approach that the Treasury and HMRC took to delivering the new legislation was, from our point of view, extremely responsive and cooperative. We were myself and our colleagues were in very frequent discussions as the legislation and the proposals were being developed. We did have, in the drafting, we had one issue when the draft legislation came out relating to the tax treatment of related party transactions, saying that we could not claim the incentive in relation to costs that we had incurred from other sister companies or parent companies or subsidiaries. And we said, well, that's obviously not right, because these companies operate at arm's length from us. We have a lighting and production services business that works for third parties just as it works for us. They're not going to, we're not going to what abuse is it exactly that you're trying to stamp out? And in those discussions, we came to an accommodation, and we're satisfied with how that has been resolved, including with a greater degree of transparency from us as to the nature of the agreements that we're in with those companies, to make sure that Treasury and HMRC can be satisfied that there is no abuse to worry about.
Anyone else have anything to add on that point at all? No? Wonderful. Back to you, Chair.
Does anyone have any issues at all or any concerns about how the VXF relief is being scoped, including generative AI, for example?
Can we say that one? I mean, there is certainly a question that the language used in the Treasury consultation in the documents refers to essentially explains that the tax will be excluded from anything that uses generative AI. Our understanding in discussions with Treasury is that they don't necessarily mean that as a kind of whole category, that they want to be more targeted about certain types of technologies that may be used for the creation of content, which would not be ordinarily used in VFX, and we think that may be reasonable. We're in those conversations with Treasury. But I mean, as a side note, AI is often a part of or within certain VFX programs that have been used for many years.
So you're getting the reassurances that you need from the Treasury?
Yeah, we're in discussions, and I think based on Gidon's earlier comments, so far on all these issues, we've had very positive relationships with Treasury.
Really good. For a moment, I need to pause the broadcast so we can all go and vote. So order, the committee is suspended. Thank you very much. Brief interlude. Welcome back, everybody. I'm going to move on to John Nicholson for our next question. Before I do, just to say we are expecting a couple more votes, but we're not quite sure when they're going to come. We will keep you posted. And also, if somebody's already, just to sort of try and get through as much as we can, if somebody's already said pretty much the comments that you were going to make, then don't feel in any way that you have to repeat them. Thank you, John.
Thank you, and apologies for that. You've just seen the ludicrousness of Westminster in practice.
Yes.
They've all trooped all that way just to go through a lobby when they could have done it electronically. Yes. Mr. Simmons, could I perhaps start with you? Because you said earlier on that Hungary and Spain often had an advantage over us, and I was interested those two countries were selected by you. Could you share some insight into what Hungary and Spain do that we don't do that we could learn from?
I think it was my colleague Benjamin who made that comment, but I'm happy to answer your question.
Sorry.
I mean, the reality is that the key things that I alluded to earlier about why the UK is so good, other countries are beginning to look at the UK and try and copy and see what they can do. And the two things that both Spain and Hungary have done is to invest in infrastructure, so that means studios, stages and skills, and also to have a tax incentive regime which is competitive with the rest of the world. And it basically fundamentally sits on those 2 points. And of course, as we'd heard too, we know about the 80% threshold. So often, or in certain circumstances, some production will be done in the UK, but also some production might be done in Hungary or somewhere like Spain. I mean, there are obviously other reasons why you might not use the UK. So geography and topography might not always be best in the UK, but certainly they are two territories which are thinking about investing in their infrastructure and their incentive models to be competitive with the UK.
Okay, apologies, Mr. King. That was your point, wasn't it? But would that be, for example, lots of the outside scenes that you quite often see in purporting to be English cities, but are actually shot in Hungary? So that'd be one reason, I suppose, when we're talking about the geography and topography and climate. But there seem to be so many other things that we could learn from.
Yes, I mean, I'd actually say for Netflix that, so many of our best-known shows and most loved shows are actually all made in the UK across the nations and regions as well. So you've got Bridgerton in the southwest, The Crown, much of which was filmed in Scotland, Sex Education in Wales. I mean, we're actually shooting 3 different shows in Scotland this year, including one which is a co-production about Lockerbie with the BBC. So we rarely use other locations in lieu of the UK when we can use the UK. That's interesting.
So what are we doing in Scotland that's attracting you that we could do more of?
Well, I mean, I think it would be very difficult to replicate Scotland's extraordinary scenery and iconic locations, and that's a lot of the reason for the draw. I mean, you know, the first criterion for us will always be, you know, the creative intent behind the show, because that's what we want to prioritise. Where there is some flexibility in terms of the creative intent, then that's when other factors come into play. But first and foremost, we want to make shows where it makes best sense to make them. So, you know, the reason that Sex Education ended up being filmed where it was filmed in South Wales was because we found this fantastic campus that we wanted to use for Moordale High, and you know, once we'd sort of discovered that location, the rest kind of fell into place. So you know, there are occasionally reasons why you might go to a specific country because it has something the UK does not. So, for example, I believe Malta has a horizon water tank, which is not something that we have in the UK. So, obviously, if you want to shoot a particular kind of scene, then Malta is the place to go for that.
Sorry, I don't know what a horizon water tank is.
As I understand, it's a little bit like a infinity swimming pool.
Oh, I see.
So, if you want to shoot something with a sort of open horizon that appears to be in the ocean but is not actually in the ocean, you need a horizon water tank. We're fast reaching the limits of my production knowledge here. But actually, from Netflix's perspective, there's so much that's attractive about the UK. You know, that is generally our first choice of sort of destination for a reason outside of the US and Canada.
That's interesting. And when you do things that are very specific to the geography or political climate, do you find that they have a wide-reaching audience? I'm thinking, for example, of Scoop. Which is you might think it was quite micro, wouldn't you? Set in the BBC, one particular programme in the BBC. I mean, I was particularly interested in it because I worked in Newsnight for years, so I recognised a lot of the features, in particular the sort of posh people against the incomers who weren't quite as posh. That was a very familiar theme, I thought, myself. But does that have a broad reach?
Well, I think this is one of the extraordinary things about, you know, storytelling. I mean, when we commission shows, we're thinking about our local audience first and foremost, but we find time and time again the best stories have a universality at their core that is, you know, relatable or, you know, kind of intriguing to people, even if they can't, you know, sort of identify with the specifics of where that world is set, because, you know, it has an authenticity that resonates with them. And those are the shows that we find do well not only in the countries in which they're made, but then also travel well around the world. And obviously there are some, you know, sort of elements and dimensions to the story of Scoop that I think fascinate everyone, whether they're British or not, whether they follow, you know, kind of inside baseball stories in Westminster and British journalism. And so yes, it did do very well for us for those reasons.
That's interesting to hear. Gentlemen, before I pass back to the chair, I'm quite interested to know overall what the threats are that you identify to the whole landscape of public service broadcasting, because of course, as you know, at the end of this we write a report, and I'm always interested in finding out what experts' recommendations are for what we should incorporate into our reports. So if I could start with you, Mr. Bird, what would be your overview of the threats to public service broadcasting? Because we were talking about this privately before, and it seems that all of the political parties have got elements within them which are hostile to public service broadcasting for a variety of different and often misplaced reasons, it seems to me.
Well, so from my personal perspective, when I look at our other international territories and I speak to content producers from around the world, public service broadcasting in this country really is the envy of the world. You know, we have in BBC, ITV and Channel 4 infrastructure, training schemes and processes that have developed incredible talent that has travelled the world over. And from our business perspective at Amazon, we've found the PSBs to be hugely cooperative and great partners. Over the last 8 years, we have spent more than $400 million licensing, co-producing and co-commissioning content from the UK PSBs, not only to make bigger and better television shows. We've helped co-produce everything from Steve McQueen's Small Axe, Phoebe Waller-Bridge's Fleabag, to the recently announced second and third seasons of The Night Manager with the BBC. Not only are we helping to make those shows in cooperation with the public service broadcasters, but we're also distributing those shows to a global audience. So those shows are available on the Prime Video platform in more than 200 countries around the world. And I think, outside of American content, British content travels the best out of any other country in the world.
Because of the language?
I think not only because of the language, but also because of the quality that we have both in front of and behind the camera. The skills,
the familiarity, presumably, people have with aspects of the cultures in the UK.
Certainly, but also, our creativity and our ability to deliver new, innovative storylines in a, easily consumable and desirable manner.
Interesting. I mean, Mr. Freeman, I always say when people attack public service broadcasting, be careful what you wish for, because it's easy enough to attack.
Well,
we have.
There's no danger at all of me attacking public service broadcasting.
I didn't think there would be.
We are. I mean, in the same way as Chris, I don't want to labour the point, but we are extremely supportive of the mixed ecology system in the UK of public service broadcasters, commercial broadcasters, video on demand services, independent producers. We think it's it is and should be the envy of the world. To take your question head on about what the greatest threat to them is, it's probably one for Mitch to answer in detail because they own a public service broadcaster in Channel 5. But as a parent of teenagers who don't spend an awful lot of time watching the BBC and ITV, I would say the biggest threats to them are the many, many other options that young people have for looking at fun stuff on screens, and I would put YouTube and TikTok at the top of that list.
Mr. Simmons.
I completely agree with the sentiments that have been expressed. I think I think fundamentally the PSBs continue to be a consistent engine of investment in the UK broadcast ecology. So as PSBs, we're investing just under £3 billion a year, and it's a consistent investment, and it's across a range of different genres. It's across current affairs, news, factual content. Channel 5 has a particular emphasis on factual content. It takes its audience on journeys, whether that's recently Michael Palin in Nigeria or whether that's Susan Cameron around Scotland, and has recently pushed into drama and a much sort of, we would say, lower price point, but nonetheless reflecting people's lives. So whether that's The Tutor of Sheridan Smith, whether that's the Madame Blanc mysteries, which people enjoy on a Saturday evening. I think fundamentally, public service broadcasters also need to be found, and it's therefore fundamental that the media bill, which has the provisions in it for prominence, are enacted as soon as possible after the legislation passes, because it's all very well us having the obligations, which we're very happy to meet and we exceed, and we're very proud of the work we do, but we also need to make sure that we can be found and that global platforms do not kind of push us out and push us to the sides.
Okay. Thank you, Chair.
Can I just ask leading on from that, Mitchell, can I just ask you about whether you feel that the kind of the threat to the PSBs, which we've already heard about, that comes from a younger generation who are very much more focused on the social media world, for example, what that means to the UK production ecosystem, in the sense that so many of our great British broadcasting talent, whether that's in front of the camera or behind it, all sort of cut their teeth in places like Channel 5 or BBC or ITV. I mean, to what extent are you concerned about the future when there are threats to our PSBs?
Well, it's definitely, I think, as was alluded to earlier in the session, it's a very challenging market with the way that audiences are moving, the way that we consume television is moving. I think Ofcom soon is going to announce its review both on PSB but also onto the future of TV distribution, which also has an impact. As Channel 5, we have moved into drama in the last 4 or 5 years. That has led to British writers, British talent, British actors finding a kind of new opportunity to find their voice, and it's certainly true. I mean, just within the Paramount the Paramount universe. Kingsley Ben-Adir was the lead actor in Bob Marley One Love, but his background, if you look at the beginning of his career, was in Vera on ITV, was doing Death in Paradise and so forth. So you're absolutely right, and I think that still is the case, that the PSBs provide that building block and stepping stone for much of our industry. And I don't see that changing in the short term, but clearly for the long term, if PSB is not effectively supported by regulation legislation, then there is a risk that those benefits are diminished in future.
Okay, thank you very much.
Nothing wrong with Death in Paradise, although Beyond Paradise is better.
Yes.
Anyway, I don't know how we got onto that. Anyway, I just wanted to probe a few views on government policy around copyrighted works by AI developers. I guess you share the concerns of many in the creative industries about content being used by AI developers without licensing, remuneration, or even labelling, basically. It's obviously shared across the music industry as well, which we're interested in as a committee. So you'll be aware of the Intellectual Property Office's working group, Copyright Code of Practice Working Group, which is a snappy title. They haven't come to an agreement on protecting copyrighted works from AI developers. So is it therefore time for government to legislate? Benjamin.
Well, we were certainly very disappointed that those IPO working group talks collapsed. We would be very supportive of government reconvening rights holders and AI developers to carry on that dialogue and to unpack all the complexity around these issues with a view to getting to some sort of solution. Ultimately, we have to strike a balance between the legitimate interests of rights holders and also not unduly stifling innovation. And at the same time, we're seeing the market evolve as lots of AI developers do seek licenses for certain uses of their tools. So I think policymakers need to keep a close eye on the market as well when determining what a proportionate response looks like.
Okay, but I mean that's a voluntary code, Chris Bird, isn't it? Do you think we should recommend the government legislate in this area?
I think it's imperative that we have open and urgent conversations about it. I think it's we're very much at the first step of the process in understanding how AI can, I'm sure, innovate and accelerate efficiency and process in our lives and our roles. But I think it's important that we take a very close look from a legislative perspective to ensure that we are protecting the rights of copyright holders and IP owners.
Yeah, I would say government, the UK government did try to legislate on this exact point 2 years ago. It ended in some disarray as to the politics of the time. We are not chomping at the bit for the government to return with that kind of legislative initiative. I would say that there are several complicated and difficult copyright-related questions that arise as a result of the emergence of AI that I am certainly not qualified to answer, and that judges at some point in the UK or in the EU or elsewhere will opine on. But the question of whether an AI enterprise has the right to make multiple copies and then distribute parts of those copies of a work protected by copyright without the copyright owner's permission is not a difficult question. The answer
by existing law.
The answer is obviously no, and the current law should deal with that. I would say that in a couple of the countries where legislation has been pursued, something along the lines of what was proposed by the UK government 2 years ago. So within my purview are a lot of the Asian jurisdictions, and in Singapore, in Japan and South Korea, a version of that text and data mining exception has been put into their copyright law. And of those three, all three are reviewing that because they think they may have gone too far. So I think government should tread carefully on legislating greater exceptions to UK copyright law.
Yeah, and so was what was tried 2 years ago just because the politics was fairly chaotic here at that time, or was what they tried just not workable?
From our perspective, it was not workable.
Right.
It would have fundamentally undermined the rights of copyright owners to determine who can copy and make available copies of their protected works.
Yeah. Okay. What's your company's policies on using generative AI tools in the production process, Mitchell?
First, I think the first point was that generative AI doesn't exist in isolation in and of itself. It usually exists within a product or a dynamic service you're using. So whether you're using a search engine or you're using a type of Adobe, and certainly within film production, as part of creative process, AI may be used in certain elements of VFX, but fundamentally, so for example, if you wanted to automatically say de-age or re-age or age a character throughout a series, that might be an example where you'll use a piece of AI. But generally speaking, our view is that nothing will replace the sort of human element of creation and production, and therefore that the AI works as a sort of digitally astute assistant to the human creator. That's how we try and think about it.
Yeah. What do you think, Benjamin?
Yes. AI we see as essentially a tool for our creatives to use. And we've got to remember that our industry is sort of characterized by a sort of continuum of technological development that has helped transform how entertainment and storytelling has evolved. And so what we're seeing is that artists are increasingly enthusiastic to explore the potential of AI as a tool in that context, and we want to support them to the extent possible. Mitchell already alluded to some of the uses. In fact, de-aging of Robert De Niro in The Irishman is quite a good example. So, visual effects, streamlining editing and post-production processes and so forth. But fundamentally, we do not believe there is any substitution for the originality and authenticity of human creativity, and we do not see AI as a replacement for artist-centered storytelling.
Yeah, that example you're giving with De Niro still had to come from a human creating the thesis, and then that just helped them do it. But that wasn't done, against his wishes. It was done presumably with his agreement as part of the production process.
And it's a very good example of AI as a tool for creatives to push the boundaries of what they've been doing all along.
Yeah, okay, all right. How's season 6 of The Crown going? Not as good figures as last one, right?
Well, we had a fantastic finale to The Crown. I think it ended on a high. It was very bittersweet from our perspective because we were incredibly proud of that series. But we'd always said that the story was going to end where it did, and we've got a number of fantastic new shows coming out this year, several of which have already launched, and many more to come. So there's lots more that's taking its place.
No regrets on no season 7, given some good storylines.
We'd always said that The Crown was going to finish where it did.
Okay, but it might start somewhere else. Prequels are all the rage.
So I've heard, but
a lot of kings and queens.
Okay. Yeah, we have. Yeah, we could go on forever with that, couldn't you? Yeah, back to you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Steve. Alex.
Yeah, I'm moving on to the issue of levies. We've had a number of directors and producers from independent production companies telling us how fragile it is, how difficult it is to get productions off the ground, how difficult it is to sort of get the right finance together. Under what circumstances would your company support a levy on video on demand platforms? May I start with you, Chris?
I think it really depends on what you really expect the levy to do that's not already happening. I think when I certainly echo the sentiment that independent producers have had a tough time of late. I think 2023 was a incredibly challenging year for a number of problems. US writers and actors strike for one, cost of living crisis, war in Ukraine, etc., etc. We really saw a suppression in availability of talent in 2023. I think we're seeing something of a rebalancing and a resurgence of that in 2024. From our perspective, a good number of our productions that were paused in 23 have reconvened or already concluded, and we're on to more film and TV show productions in 24 than we had done in 23 or 22. So I think the outlook is much brighter for the independent sector now than it has been in the past.
Benjamin, what's the Amazon view on this?
So I think from Netflix's perspective, again, the question has to be what problem are we trying to solve? And if it is addressing the issue of market failure for smaller budget films, well, we're delighted, obviously, that we have the independent film tax credit now. That is the intervention that industry campaigned for such a long time. And now that that has been introduced, I think, it's only right to let it take effect and see if it is successful in addressing market failure in the way that we hope. We're very confident that it will be. I think it will be a huge fillip to that part of the industry. And I think what needs to happen now is for that intervention to to correct that market failure, and then we can see where the industry stands after that. But I'm very confident that it will address the problems which have been highlighted to date by the sector.
I'll move to a slightly different subject. I hosted Chris Marsh the other week, who's the director of Bobby, the documentary, and after the media bill, you at a Westminster conference said that the media bill could prove unworkable or risk a chilling effect in terms of the ability and the appetite to create documentaries in the UK. Is that still your view? Is it still going to be an issue going forward?
We've always been very supportive of the media bill in general, and also very supportive of the principle of Netflix coming under Ofcom's jurisdiction. We did have some concerns with the legislation as it was initially drafted, that it wasn't necessarily setting everyone up for success in terms of understanding how requirements around impartiality might be transposed in a video on demand context. I do think we've made some very good progress during the passage of the bill, and indeed before it was introduced, thanks to some changes which DCMS made ahead of time. So I think that the bill is in a much better place now. We're looking forward to discussing implementation in great detail with Ofcom, and I'm confident that the overall impact on what audiences can enjoy on screen is going to be as small as it can be.
Mitchell, what's your view on the levy?
Exactly to Benjamin's point about what the problem is you're trying to solve. I think we would take the view that the two points really. The first is about unintended consequences and what happens in the wider market. The idea of a policy that looks at one sort of specific area of the sector, so only VOD services. So for us, that would be Paramount Plus, and doesn't recognise the potential impact on other services. So where we've seen levies in other jurisdictions on VOD services, we've then seen inflation in the market, and so then local broadcasters, particularly in places like Italy, have then found that the prices have gone up because there's been sort of forced increase in spend, and then others have suffered as a consequence. So I think we would be very cautious from that regard. And the second area, I think, is just as Benjamin said, that we much prefer kind of horizontal interventions in the market which everyone can benefit from. I think if you want to support a mixed ecology, then you need to have interventions that can benefit smaller broadcasters, larger broadcasters, smaller streamers, independent producers, and everyone. And that's the way that policy development has taken place so far, and we think that's why the UK has become such a powerhouse in global content creation.
Coming back to that point, the UK is a global it has become a global powerhouse because of our independent production sector. So if we're not going to go down the road of a levy, what do you think we could do to support the independent production sector in the UK?
Well, I think the two interventions that have been made recently in legislation are fundamental. So the changes to VFX in the tax credit system, the support for independent film. We think getting the media bill passed will boost public service broadcasters and their continued investment and working with independent producers. Certainly on the Channel 5 side of our business, we really work with some very, very small, almost one or two person independent producers, often in the regions. We think that those kind of current measures are the ones that we should be focused on.
And has Netflix got any other ideas in terms of how to support the independent sector?
Well, I think from our perspective, the best way that we can support the independent production sector is by continuing to commission as much as we possibly can. And as I said at the start of this session, we are investing around $1.5 billion every year in UK-made content. We work with a very broad range of producers right across the country on all different kinds and genres of show. And we feel that in addition to the investment that we make in training, which is something that I'm sure we'll also come on to discuss, is the way that we can best help the sector to continue to not only thrive but flourish and succeed.
Is that your view as well? More investment to support the
Absolutely. I think we need to just focus on the market conditions that will generate excellence for us, and I think that comes through first and foremostly education and skills, ensuring that we're bringing through enough new young people who have the creative freedom to be able to go out and be the next Phoebe Waller-Bridge or Emerald Fennell or Jeremy Clarkson and create brilliant content for us, create an infrastructure that enables that success, studio space, production facilities, etc., and instill the ambition and the opportunity for people to be able to build their careers in this space and go on to extol the virtues of the excellence in the creative economy that we have currently.
Because we've seen either levies or a sort of minimum obligation to invest in some other jurisdictions. Has that affected how you've invested in those jurisdictions or not at all?
I'm not an expert on our international business, but I do know in some of our territories, to echo Ben and Mitch's point, where we are required to invest in certain areas, we do find that it increases cost in those areas, sometimes unnecessarily so, and slows down the process of creativity and innovation.
Mitchell, I think Benjamin addressed that, but I don't think you really addressed that point. Have you seen any changes in any other countries?
Yeah, exactly those points alluded to earlier. I think we operate streaming services in some of those jurisdictions that have had increased levy obligations and often complicated structures of quotas and sub-quotas. I think just a point to add, I suppose, is that we often find some of those territories is that where you create strict obligations specifically on one section of the industry, so specifically on VOD services, what you essentially do is you create a sort of cap on investment. So rather than services saying, well, we will just make a bigger show here one year and then a different kind of show here somewhere else, what you do is you see a dynamic where people say, well, this is what we have to invest, so that's what we'll invest in that territory and we won't invest anymore. So
it's a ceiling rather than
it ends up often in some instances as a ceiling. We can write to you with some more data.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Can I just come in on that final point, because we share the same view that incentives, financial incentives, are preferable to legal obligations as a way of driving investment in content. And our two biggest production locations in the world are the US and the UK, where there are generous incentives available or effective incentives available and no legal obligations. But the point I was going to make is partly that the UK doesn't have a tradition of that kind of dramatic intervention. And some of the countries of continental Europe, in particular France, but also Italy and to a lesser extent Spain, do have that kind of tradition. And they don't just levy a charge on video on demand services, they also do it on cinema admissions and DVD sales and every other mode of distribution. And as a result, they generate this enormous pot that the film agency gets to spend, and they mostly spend it supporting French culture on shows that would not meet a commercial threshold for production. And there was a report last month from the Corps des Comptes, the French equivalent of the National Audit Office, their National Audit Office, that found that the proportion of CNC-funded films that broke even at the French box office was 2%. That means that that shows are being produced for perfectly valid cultural reasons, but that wouldn't get made commercially, and we're businesses. So our strong view would be that it's not something that the UK government should pursue.
Thanks, Alex. Benjamin, just going back quickly to what you talked about, investment that you do to support independence. How does the IP work with that? Are they able to retain their intellectual property, or does Netflix then take that on?
Well, we don't have a one-size-fits-all model, so we will do different deals with different producers depending on the specifics of the show. And I think it's that flexibility both that we offer, but also that the sort of a very plural market offers overall, which means that there are multiple routes for different producers depending on what they value most.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Chair. I want to move on to studio infrastructure, and this question is to all of you, so we'll just go along the line. NBC, Universal and Sky have invested in building studios. Netflix and Amazon have long-term leases with studios. Paramount does not have its own facilities here. I'd like to know what's informed your company's decisions whether to invest in a long-term base in the UK or not. And if we start with Chris.
Sure. I'd say the joy and the privilege of being here in the UK is that we have a huge talent pool, and I think first and foremost, being a creator and a talent-facing business, we care about the pool of talent that we have. We want to tell the stories that our audiences, both in this country and abroad, want to see and hear, and we want to make that with the talent that are engaged and excited and committed to this territory. So we start really with that pool of creatives, and then we look at what is required to operationalise and convert that vision into film and TV. And in Shepperton, we've taken a long-term lease to build out a studio space there that is really state-of-the-art, one that we can produce one of our biggest TV shows in the world, The Lord of the Rings, Rings of Power, shot there for much of last year, and it really is a state-of-the-art facility that will see us through for many, many years. And we're very, very excited and enthused about the future of our space there.
So the Sky and NBC Universal reference, I think that's a reference to Sky Studios Elstree, which is run by our sister company Sky, but where a lot of the content is Universal Productions. The driving force behind it was that up until the point where we had control of our own, or our overall company had control of our own physical studio, we were having to find space every single time, and this creates an element of reliability. And then if there's spare capacity, then third parties can produce there and have done. But as a general rule, it will be where our overall company is producing its works. Our colleagues at Sky are extremely proud of Sky Studios Elstree. I've been around there. It's absolutely fantastic. If you haven't been, then would happily connect you to make that happen. Most recently, we had two movies under the Wicked banner, one coming out in November and one next November, that we're shooting there. The next iteration of the next episode of the Jurassic franchise is in pre-production there, as is Bridget Jones, the next Bridget Jones. So there's a lot of exciting stuff happening, and having our own facility or a sister company's own facility to produce it in just creates reliability.
I think for Netflix, the decision to take long-term leases at Shepperton and Longcross, which was made a few years ago now, when we originally made the decision to double down on our production and investment commitment in the UK, was, much as Gidon says, about creating surety in terms of supply and access to infrastructure. Obviously, the decision to take those leases specifically was to some extent dictated by what was available on the market at the time. But certainly we have been very pleased with both of those sites. I think the recent expansion at Shepperton is hugely impressive. We ourselves have made a sizable capital expenditure investment in Longcross, which was formerly an MOD site, although it had been used for production before we took it over. But we made a sizable investment to bring that up to a very 21st century specification, refurbishing all the stages, building new sound stages, refurbishing office space and workshop space, to spec it for pretty much anything we might want to make there in the future. And so we feel across those two sites, and then in addition to everything that we do on location across the nations and regions in the UK, we are very well kind of supplied in terms of infrastructure needs at the moment.
Mitchell.
So it's simply been a business decision from Paramount, and we've sat in front of Treasury a number of times and said, well, why don't you purchase somewhere or take a lease on somewhere, that we've enjoyed the flexibility of being able to shoot wherever we want, I suppose, to a certain extent, and we've not wanted to run a studio business in the UK, but that hasn't prevented our appetite to be continuously filming in the UK, and it being a home away from Hollywood to a certain extent, and whether that means we're doing Sexy Beast in Liverpool or A Gentleman Moscow in Manchester, or we turned Glasgow into Philadelphia for World War Z. We filmed Rocket Man in Greenford in a Royal Mail package facility, and we've got a number of projects at the moment actually at Leavesden, including a Guy Ritchie project. So we have enjoyed the flexibility of not having a studio, and I think we've just announced Ridley Scott's Bee Gees biopic to be filmed in the UK. So I think from our perspective, if you were to speak to our business and our sort of real estate folks, they would simply say, look, we always find somewhere to produce in the UK when we want to, and we're really happy with the bountiful, good quality studio spaces that we find.
And do you think the UK has enough studio infrastructure to keep up with all of your company's needs? A very quick, we'll go that way this time.
Yes, sometimes it can certainly be a challenge to find studio space, but we've always found space. And I think that the current trajectory where there's increased investment's been announced, such as the recent investment in Sunderland and elsewhere, has been a positive. So we look at the UK very positively in terms of stage space.
Yes, certainly demand fluctuates. We often need to take, sort of shorter-term leases on a production-by-production basis. But as Mitchell says, there's been significant investment in this area over the last few years, and I think that's really paying dividends now.
Gidon?
Yes.
Yes.
I wouldn't look at it as a static perspective. I think we would also always want to be raising the bar on the quality of the production facilities we have in this country, and I think we've done that incredibly well the last few years, but I think we need to continue doing so.
Great. And to what extent does the UK's virtual production studio infrastructure attract productions here, and would a more extensive virtual production resource base in the US mean you would not need to film as much in the UK? Again, just very brief answers.
I think we will always need to film in the UK. For us, it's about the talent and the storytelling and the content production. I certainly can see virtual stages providing an innovative and efficient way of creating content, but I don't think they're any substitute for studio sets or location filming.
Yeah, I share that view entirely.
Yeah, I mean, we're watching the evolution of virtual production with interest. I think as the costs are coming down, the application is becoming a bit more widespread. At the same time, we do see its potential use as being relatively specific, and so we're not overly focused on sort of building additional capacity in this area at the time.
I don't have anything to add to those comments.
And Mitchell, you've alluded to this in a previous answer, but does not having a tie to a physical studio give Paramount more flexibility about shooting in the nations and regions in the UK?
Well, it's certainly true that we have always been very comfy shooting in the nations and regions, as I alluded to earlier. I don't know whether having a studio would tie you down. I mean, certainly, to an earlier answer, there are certain parts of the UK which mean you need to be outside and not in a stage or in a studio space. I mean, when Tom Cruise jumps off a mountain in Austria but magically lands in the Peak District, you need the Peak District and you need to be in Derbyshire to film that. So I'm not quite sure that it having studio space or not having studio space will necessarily impact the outcomes for where studios are spending money. I think the reality is that it's the directors and the creatives who will push what kind of spaces they want for their content.
Thank you. And Gidon, there's a perception that productions parachute into an area, shoot a few scenes and then leave. What would incentivise NBC Universal to make longer-term commitments to the nations and regions of the UK and work more closely with communities?
Well, we have produced extensively outside of London and the South East. I mean, in recent years, we would count Mary Queen of Scots in Scotland, Dad's Army in Yorkshire, Dr. Dolittle in Cumbria, Brave New World, a TV season in South Wales, Dracula in Northern Ireland, and currently in physical production is How to Train Your Dragon, also in Northern Ireland. And in all of those places, we engage actively with the local community and with the local screen agency to make sure that we are maximising the benefits of our investment for other productions likely to come their way. I guess the truth is that we do have access to our sister company's physical studio space just on the fringes of London. So most studio stage space that we're likely to need is going to be fulfilled from Sky Studios Elstree.
And Benjamin, regional screen agencies suggest that streamers' content should be subject to made outside London quotas, as public service broadcasters are. What changes would require this to happen and to the existing regulatory framework?
Well, I think it's something of a moot question from Netflix's perspective, because we do so much already in the nations and regions. And, to the point that Gidon was making a moment ago, I think, especially when you look at returning series, that's where you start to see the real benefit for sort of local communities in helping to establish creative clusters. So if you take a show like Sex Education, for example, that was filmed across 5 seasons in South Wales, we ran a training programme across all those seasons where new entrants came on at the start of the season in various departments, were trained up, and then for the next season came back as full-time crew, and a new kind of tranche came in sort of underneath them, and that's what helped to really develop the crew base in that particular part of the country. So we are doing those sorts of things all over the UK at the moment, and so from our perspective, I think a quota is somewhat academic, but ultimately I think we should be making shows that are in the best interests of audiences and what people want to watch, rather than simply to fulfil quotas, because that doesn't always, I think, produce the best outcomes from a creative perspective.
And Chris, what would such a quota of made outside of London be on the impact of such a quota on how Amazon commissions content?
I mean, again, I feel it's probably a moot point for Amazon as well, because we do so many shows outside of London and the southeast.
Would a quota have any impact on what you do?
I mean, the risk of it is that it artificially drives productions to areas where potentially there is better opportunities elsewhere. For example, in the last 5 or 6 years or so, we've made 7 seasons of television in Scotland. We've made Good Omens, we've made The Rig, we have the upcoming Anansi Boys, we've created some 750 jobs up there. We've worked very, very closely with Screen Scotland on infrastructure, apprenticeship programs, skills and trainings. We've invested more than £50 million in that sector. If we were needed to fulfill some quota in some other part of the UK, would that pull us away from a particular region as a result of that? I don't know. It's not something I would encourage us to spend a lot of time thinking about. What I would encourage us to think about is, how do we encourage creatives right the way across the UK, in every town, city and region, to come up with filmmaking and television ideas that we can then conceptualize. We have audiences right the way across the UK, audiences from the entire size and scope of the UK want to be seeing themselves reflected on screen. We want to bring that level of diversity, storytelling and innovation to life, and that's what we're focusing on converting.
Thanks, Julie. Jane?
Thank you, Chair. I'd like to turn to skills and training. Adrian Wotton from the British Film Commission, who is a fellow Wolfrunian and Wolverhampton Wanderers fan, so obviously a very wise man indeed, said that we've put ourselves in a fantastically competitive position because of our infrastructure, tax reliefs and our talents, but it is in our hands to lose that work. The biggest factor will not be tax reliefs or studio space, it will be whether we have the people to do it. So could I ask what proportion of your overall spending in the UK is invested in skills and training? I'll just whiz down the...
Yeah, so I mean, I completely agree that the future lifeblood of our industry is in skills and trainings. We have to be bringing in a new diversity of thought and perspective to our industry, and we have to be creating educational tools, training opportunities to develop into lifelong careers for people in this market. By the way, I sit on the Creative Industries Council and I'm in the Skills and Education Training Working Group. We want to be able to see right the way across the creative industries more than 1 million jobs created by 2030 in this space. I see a huge number of those coming from the film and TV sector. At Prime Video, we've developed a program called the Prime Video Pathways, where we've invested £10 million in the last 3 years, specifically to generate skill training and apprenticeship opportunities for people in this space. We've helped more than 1,000 people gain broader training or education over the last 3 years, and almost 300 new apprenticeship positions within the creative industries within Amazon. So this is something that's that we feel deeply passionate about something that we want to continue to drive and scale in the coming years. And there's lots more that we can do, including reforming apprenticeship levies and finding new ways in which we can educate secondary school children about the opportunities that exist for them in film and TV.
Have you been spending enough, do you think? £10 million over 3 years?
I mean, there's 1,000 people who would tell you that they have opportunities that they didn't have without us, and I think that's a great number, but I agree, we're only just starting.
Gidon.
Look, I think it's very difficult to quantify with a precise figure how much we spend on training, skills and workforce development. That's partly because in the way of a big organisation, it comes from multiple different pots. Some of it is spent centrally at the corporate level, some of it is spent on production. Should I stop? Do you need to go and vote?
Yes, we will. We're all
Initial answer.
Okay, I was going to say
you've got time to look up your figures.
Okay.
Because you're all members of the Screen Sector Skills Task Force, so you should have some idea of the figures. And in the meantime, order. We're all going to go and vote. Thank you. Nicholson.
Well, thank you very much. Gentlemen, I've heard from a number of different people that streamers' viewership data is considered sensitive, commercially sensitive, and some people tell me that results perhaps in creators not being sufficiently rewarded when their shows do well. I mean, first of all, can I ask you, Mr. King, if you think that this is true, and if so, what can be done about it?
Well, Netflix is the most transparent streamer in terms of the amount of data that we share. So between our top 10 lists, which are publicly available on a dedicated website, our most popular lists, and also the various data points that we share with the producers that we work with, and the fact that we're now a member of BARB, and so BARB also reports on viewing figures. We did decide last year that we wanted to go even further, and that was why we have started to put out twice a year an engagement report which lists the hours viewed of all the shows in our catalogue over the last 6 months. So we think that is an exceptional sort of new benchmark setting level of transparency. It's very easy to interpret. It is a sort of measure of engagement that can be easily compared with other data sources like Nielsen, etc. And so, I think that, from a transparency perspective, what Netflix is doing is hopefully best in class.
So do you think creators would say, as a result of this increased transparency, their successes, when they have successes, are rewarded financially in the way that they should be?
I'd certainly hope so. I mean, that's a question for them. But in terms of the amount of data that they have available to see how their shows have performed, there's certainly no shortage in terms of what Netflix shares.
Mr. Bird.
Yes, I'm delighted to say we've also recently joined BARB, so there's publicly available full visibility on the performance of our television shows. Even more delighted to say BARB's report from last week shows Clarkson's Farm as the #1 television show in the country.
I mean, congratulations. How lovely. I must catch up with it sometime. So, in answer to the same question, do you think that creatives are now adequately rewarded, or would believe that they are adequately rewarded?
I certainly hope so. I mean, I don't have any evidence directly to the contrary.
Mr. Freeman, Mr. Simmons?
We don't operate a...
No, you don't. I'll just ask you if you want to chip in or if you're just happy not to.
Happy not to.
I would just say that we have a multiple, similar to the others, we have a number of different models. I would say one of the interesting things about the way that we operate in the UK is that for our UK commissions for Paramount Plus, it's actually the same commissioning team as Channel 5. So it's the same commissioners, they understand the UK market. And what we do is we often have a similar model to a PSB model where we will commission, have sort of Paramount Plus as the sort of first run broadcaster, equivalent to a broadcaster, and then the producer will take the secondary rights and retain those rights so they're able to get remunerated on that. So something like Insomnia, which is coming soon to Paramount Plus with Vicky McClure, so that we have that model for UK commissions for Paramount Plus.
Thanks, John. Clive.
Mitchell's, can I ask you about Paramount Plus? Since you've introduced Paramount Plus, are you making more film content and reserving it for your streaming platforms, or are you making the same amount of volume and as before, and therefore giving fewer titles to cinema releases?
So for Paramount, we absolutely believe in the mixed ecology, as I think I've said earlier. In terms of films, we absolutely believe in theatrical release. And I think to the comments I made earlier about something like Blue Story, which is a British film we supported, that if you have a strong release in the UK, that sends a signal, a theatrical release, that sends a signal to the wider market, so that when we then go and either try and release that film via have a theatrical release in other markets, you've got a good sense of the show from what's happened in the UK, and also then further down the line when our distribution teams are selling those shows into pay TV providers or public broadcasters around the world, we can point to a strong theatrical release. So we absolutely believe in theatrical release. We believe it's the engine at the front of the train for most films. There are some small films, maybe kids films or specific films that we might make that go straight to streaming, but primarily we're making films in the UK and we're making films for theatrical release.
Do you limit the amount of time they're available for theatrical release? Doing, for instance, Netflix quite often limits the time that they're on releasing for theatrical performance. So do you do the same?
No, I think if theatres want our films and we're able to have them on theatrical release, we will do that.
So Benjamin, why do you give such short cinema releases?
Well, at Netflix, we believe that our first responsibility is towards our members, and so we want them, wherever possible, to be able to see the content that they have paid for first on Netflix, rather than ask them to pay a second time to see it at the cinema. Now, it's often the case that in order to meet the eligibility criteria for awards, which understandably are very important to talent and very important generally in our industry, we're required to give certain films a theatrical release. But wherever we can, we try to put our members' best interests first.
So you feel that the theatrical release disadvantages your people who subscribe to your platform?
Well, you're effectively asking people who are already paying you a monthly subscription to either pay a second time to watch that at the cinema if they want to see it when it first comes out, or you're giving people who aren't Netflix subscribers an opportunity to see content which, in theory, should be exclusive to Netflix. So, as I say, we make allowance for awards criteria because, that's understandably important. But, we do think that the compact we have with our members is an important one, and part of that is ensuring that wherever possible, they can see the content that they are in effect paying for by subscribing to us first on Netflix.
So in your surveys of your customers, is that what they tell you, that they expect your content to be on your platforms as soon as possible?
We know that our members do not want to pay twice to see the same content.
Okay, and Gidon, how much does Reliance does NBC Universal have on the exhibition sector, and what, if anything, would you like to see done to improve its fortunes?
Well, we are extremely supportive of the theatrical release, of the theatrical window, full stop. We've had great success in recent years. You'll have seen that 2023 Universal was the top performing studio at the UK box office after Super Mario Brothers and Oppenheimer did extremely well, along with a number of our other films. And we think that the experience of going to the cinema is remarkably good value compared with an awful lot of other leisure activities. It's true that during the pandemic, when everybody was stuck at home and all the cinemas in the world were closed, we experimented, pioneered even, new distribution models, including putting films into the home on the same day as their theatrical release or within very short order following the theatrical release. The theatrical market, but I would say that the fact that that a film like Oppenheimer came to Universal when the director Christopher Nolan could have gone to any studio is evidence of our company's commitment and our executives' commitment to to working with exhibition and giving the very best films the very best possibility of being seen as the director intended them on the big screen. In the UK, 2023 for us was 12% up on 2022, but still 20% down on the average box office figure of 2017 to 2019. 2 years ago, as we were coming out of the pandemic, the first full year of cinemas being open was 2022, and that was in some countries 50% down on the 2017 to 19 average. So it feels like we are working our way back to a steady state. The effect but we're not there yet, and the strikes didn't help, and will have a knock-on effect 6 months from now or a year from now, when the titles that would have been being produced towards the end of last year are suddenly not available for distribution, causing issues with distribution schedules and timing. One of the effects that we worried about in our written submission was that those trends, combined with the fact that a lot of the major exhibition chains were quite heavily indebted, meant that there was a risk that some of them would go out of business. And we have seen in the last 6 months or so 17 multiplex closures around the UK. Now, we have seen 7 of them reopen under different ownership, but even among the 10 so that's 10 that are gone, but even among the 7 that have phoenixed, and among the others, a lot of the big multiple operators that run chains of cinemas, they are putting some of their screens dark for half of the week. And so what was once a 15-screen multiplex might be, for 4 days of the week, effectively a 10-screen multiplex. That has a lot of implications for staffing and so on. But it means that we do face, us and exhibition collectively, a challenge in bringing the full audience back.
And the last part of the question was, what, if anything, would you like to see done to improve the? I
mean, we work collaboratively with exhibition in every country where we operate, so I don't have any particular requirements or to demand from them. I think I don't have any particular demands. It's just a slow process of building the audience back in as effective a way as possible.
Chris, how important is the cinema release to Amazon films?
Well, we are very supportive of the theatrical environment, and we always have been, really, ever more so since our recent acquisition of the MGM Studios brand in 2022. And to cite a few recent examples, Saltburn, Emil Fennell's film, which we theatrically released firstly at the London Film Festival in October last year, following on to giving it a full theatrical from October, November. The film grossed more than £6 million at the box office, ran for a full 2 months before premiering on the Prime Video platform, and then still went on to be one of our most successful films on the platform. So we see theatrical as a integral and important part, not only of the way we release films, but also for the continuation of the importance of the film sector. We want to see films in theatre, and we want customers to have the choice over where they watch them.
And this is a question to all of you. I'll start with you, Chris, with it, and if anyone else wants to come in. So what would be the impact on your releases of introducing a French model with long statutory gaps between cinema releases and the availability to purchase or stream? I'll start with you, Chris, and I'll come along the line.
I think any business model where you create demand for an asset and then restrict availability of that asset is challenging. And when you think about the complexity, the cost involved, and the time and effort that it takes to generate awareness, marketing campaigns, and PR campaigns for films, putting them into a blackout period where they are simply unavailable becomes very challenging to reignite the awareness of those films when they release a platform. So that's not something I would wish to see in the UK.
Okay. Anyone have comments on that? Sir?
I mean, that is a peculiarity of the French system that is not replicated in precisely that way anywhere in the world, and is a market intervention that the UK doesn't require and that the UK would not benefit from.
Thank you very much, and back to Jane.
Thank you, Chair, and apologies to run out in the middle. Training and skills. I was talking about the proportion of proportion of your UK spending is investing in skills. Gidon, I think I interrupted your answer, which was just beginning.
That's fine. I think the division bell did, but we'll let that go. So I was going to say we do workforce development. We have a specific team that focuses on workforce development and skills everywhere that we produce. We think that's an essential part of cultivating long-term links with local areas and making sure that the pipeline of young new talent is there for when our productions are ready to go back. I would say that the sum total of our contribution to the skills bundle is partly things like paying into the Screen Investment Fund levy under Screen Skills. It's partly through colleagues of ours at Working Title who helped with the creation of the London Screen Academy and who part-sponsored the creation of Elstree Screen Arts, 2 of the 14 to 19 colleges that focus on craft and technical skills in particular, and have an extremely clear focus on diversity and creating opportunities for young people from underrepresented groups on the behind the camera and in front of the camera. We have also participated in or organised skills and training boot camps in both Wales and Northern Ireland, where we've been producing there, and we had a pretty cool project with the Mayor of London to bring in young Londoners who would not have been exposed to the opportunities of working on a Universal film set for 2 of our more recent productions. So I think we're confident that we're doing everything that we can. We also participated, as most of us did, with the BFI's Skills Task Force and are staying engaged in that as the recommendations that they came up with move towards an implementation phase.
Thank you. On diversity and inclusion, I have the highest youth unemployment rate in the country, which is awful. I would love to see some young people from areas that aren't traditional production sites also having access to these sort of fantastic opportunities in the industry. I think it's an industry that they wouldn't dream of imagining a career in at the moment. So do you think there's enough link up with colleges and sort of getting the message out that it may involve moving home or?
Well, one would hope that it shouldn't need to involve moving home. I'm sure there isn't enough link up with colleges. I've described 2 of the link ups that we have had, but I'm sure there could be more. And I know that the people involved in both of those schools are interested in what other opportunities there might be in the Midlands or in the North. I also think, is it Wolverhampton?
Yes.
Yeah, that the new studios that Stephen Knight is building in Birmingham will be an opportunity, and hopefully the sort of anchor tenant of a new cultural quarter that will create opportunities that should spill out into the Black Country as well.
So, Benjamin.
Well, I certainly agree with the hypothesis, I think, of Adrian Wootton that, skills is the most pressing challenge that our industry faces. There is a danger it's fast becoming the weakest link as other areas such as incentives and infrastructure get more attention. It's been a consistent priority for Netflix. We train over 1,000 people a year on a combination of placements on our own productions, classroom training and industry partnerships, and we've done this for several years. So we've trained over 5,000 people in the last 5 years. I think to the point that you just made about helping young people, and particularly from more deprived backgrounds, we're passionately committed to seeing how we can tackle the sort of challenge of social mobility in our sector. Culture and creativity has long had a class problem. We've done lots of work with a wonderful academic called Sam Freeman on this particular topic. We also have a brilliant partnership right now with the National Youth Theatre called Ignite, which is specifically about giving young people in some more disadvantaged areas the opportunity to see what career opportunities there are behind the scenes in our industry and build up their networks. And we've been running that programme in parts of Wales, Yorkshire and the North East. We also have a sort of documentary talent fund competition every year for aspiring documentary filmmakers to make a short documentary with both financial assistance and mentoring from Netflix, and a host of other initiatives as well. So I think, this does need to be the number one priority for our sector. It's certainly something that, we've identified as an issue that we want to put as much resource into as possible. Broadly, there are 5 areas where we see particularly pressing shortages where we're focusing our efforts. So that would be production management, production accounting, VFX, post-production and music supervision. So those are the areas where we're focused. But I think if you speak to most people in the sector, they would say that the skills shortages that we face are actually universal.
Thank you, Mitchell.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I think, as Gidon said, we sat in a room with Adrian Wood and others on the BFOI's Skills Sector Task Force, and I'll try and just pick up on a couple of points, I think. The first is that when we sat in those rooms and had those conversations, what came out of that review was essentially that industry is spending a lot on skills, but how it is spending, the kind of strategic execution of that skills delivery is not necessarily as optimal as it can be. And so, for example, having skills money that's held in levies that are in vertical chains, so for kids or drama or whatever, when actually skills are transferable across divisions, that's something that the industry needs to be looked at. I think we're something very supportive of. I think another element that's come out is the unfortunate inability of our sector to fully draw down from the apprenticeship levy, which I think is something that we need to look at. So I think the industry has, certainly in the last 18 months, really got its act together by being in the same room and saying, okay, we all want to benefit skills, we're all spending money, how can we do it better? And I think that's a really positive thing to take away. I should just flag on there's multiple things I could flag on Paramount Features particularly. I think we're the only studio that commits to the BFI diversity inclusion standards on every single feature that we produce, and that has a skills element, so we often work with Mama Youth for trainees and other individuals. And I should flag that a new project that was worked with, led by the production team on Savage House, which was working with reformed ex-offenders and finding a pathway for them into our industry, which again, to your comments before about those who would never see themselves working in the creative sector, ex-offenders is someone that they may never ever see an opportunity. So we worked on those, the Savage House, which is a wonderful Claire Foy, Richard E. Grant project that's coming out at some point soon.
Fantastic. And I'm going to come back down the line, just based on the current apprenticeship sort of pilots or models that you're familiar with, what specific changes does government need to make to the apprenticeship system, and which, if they were to be more workable, which areas of skills would be the priorities that you'd want to focus those apprenticeships opportunities on in the future? Shall I come back?
So very briefly, the apprentices that we have, we don't have any in-house production, so they go into IT, marketing, accounting, finance, technical functions, which is obviously very important for our sector, but we have an inability, due to the criteria of it needing to be an accredited 12-month course, that we have an inability to draw down levy money to use and have apprentices in those sectors. And what we would like to see, essentially, and the task force is looking at this, is an increased flexibility for us to focus on skills, so that we are able to have we can use apprenticeship levy for skills and training across productions and on the production sector, the creative aspect of our work, rather than in those more sort of corporate functional elements of our operations.
Thank you, Benjamin. You've mentioned already some priorities, but
yes, and I think the screen sector skills task force has obviously looked into this in some depth and made its own conclusions and recommendations, which we fully support. Fundamentally, what it boils down to is greater flexibility. So we need to do away with the 12-month contract rule, which is completely unworkable for a project-based industry like ours. But we also need to ensure that a proportion of the levy is available for skills development, which isn't tied to apprenticeship standards, because those standards aren't always necessary in an industry like ours. And again, it places, artificial restrictions on how the money can be spent, which means that at the moment about 80% of levy funds don't go back into the industry, which is a terrible waste when it is such a priority for us all.
Absolutely. Gidon.
I don't have anything to add. I agree entirely with what they both said.
Thank you, and Chris.
Just two things to add. We need to incentivise high-quality training providers. We've worked closely with the National Film and Television School. They certainly meet the bar for amongst the best in the country in terms of providing those skills. We need to find ways to scale that or encourage other training providers to invest more and upskill their output. Secondly, again, looking at the flexibility around how we use the levy and potentially allowing overhead costs to be used in some kind of agency model where they could be fungible enough to cover the costs of a 12-month placement where somebody might only be working in production for blocks of 2 months here, 2 months there, covering the learning experience in between those blocks, and more importantly, covering that person's overheads. So those two things we think are really important. I think the task force believes that there's more than 1,000 apprenticeships a year available if we were to unlock those two things right now.
Thank you very much. I know we're short of time, so I'm going to hand back to the chair.
Yeah, very, very quickly. I'm going to ask for a yes or no answer off of all of you. The BFI suggests that companies put in voluntarily 1% of their production budgets towards training. Is your company hitting or exceeding that 1%, Chris?
We are spending 10 million over the last 3 years. I'm not sure where that sits as part of our overall contribution, but we're heavily incentivized to contribute to skills and training.
Maybe write and let us know whether that whether that constitutes 1%, because that wasn't a yes or no answer.
Okay.
Thank you. Let's try you. Gidon.
Yes or no is my answer. I will happily write to you, Chair, and confirm the details.
Going very well so far, Benjamin.
Yes, I believe so. Yes.
By the way, I believe we are too, but I want to be sure before I write to you.
All right. Okay.
I will do the same as NBC Universal and write to you.
All right, John.
Yes, could I just ask Mr. King a question? We were all talking in our private meeting beforehand about all the things that we were enjoying watching and binge watching for some of us. And a number of different people mentioned Baby Reindeer, which is one of yours. I think it's had 54 million views worldwide or something like that. So huge, huge success. But it was a difficult watch, wasn't it? And I just wonder what your duty of care rules are in series like that or productions like that. Were you concerned about the characters being identified and the effect that it would have on the characters concerned?
Baby Reindeer is an extraordinary story, and it is obviously a true story of the horrific abuse that the writer and protagonist Richard Gadd suffered at the hands of a convicted stalker. We did take every reasonable precaution in disguising the real-life identities of the people involved in that story in the making of the show.
She's been identified,
whilst
hasn't she?
Also striking a balance with the veracity and authenticity of Richard's story, because we didn't want to anonymise that or make it generic to the point where it was no longer his story, because that would undermine the intent behind the show. And we did also work very closely with the Susie Lampley Trust, who runs Britain's National Stalking Helpline, and also We Are Survivors, in promoting and launching the show. And they've said a lot subsequently about what the series has done to drive the conversation around this often quite taboo topic, particularly for male victims of stalking, and the amount of interest and inquiries it's driven to their organisations.
It was a fascinating story and very disturbing. But I understand that the woman concerned, the Martha in real life, has now been identified. So presumably this will have quite a significant impact on her life. She's Scottish, I think, and works in the legal profession and is now contemplating legal action, I understand, because of the effect it's had on her life. And I just wondered what your thought process was about her and the effect that this would have on her, because obviously somebody who's impacted by quite serious mental health problems.
Richard Gadd was very clear that that was not the intent of the show, that it should inspire people to try and track down the sort of real-life individuals. Ultimately, it's obviously very difficult to control what viewers do, particularly in a world where everything is amplified by social media. But fundamentally, this was about Richard's story and telling Richard's story in a truthful way. I personally wouldn't be comfortable with a world in which we decided it was better that Richard was silenced and not allowed to tell his story. So obviously, we are following the situation very closely.
Did you offer any contact or support for the Martha character in real life?
I cannot get into the specifics of what happened around the making of the show, because it wouldn't be appropriate for me to comment, and I don't want to give further fuel to some of the theories which are circling on the internet.
Thank you very much, John. I know you all have to go, and I'm so grateful for the amount of time you've given us this today. When you write to me with your details about your spending on skills, can you also answer one last question from me? If you could make one key policy request of the government right now that we should make as a recommendation of our report, please, what would it be? Thank you very much. And thank you for all your time today and all your patience while we've been running around doing all this voting. Order, order.